Before the 1960s, Boat Harbour had no negative connotations. It was a tidal estuary connecting to the Northumberland Strait. Surrounding it is home to Pictou Landing First Nation. Boat Harbour is known in Mi'kmaq as Aseg, or the Other Room. With the promise of government support, Scott Paper Company announces plans to build a $50 million pulp mill at Abercrombie Point in 1964. That's about $400 million today. With the province's coal industry waning, this news is celebrated. An effluent treatment site would be required. Boat Harbour is earmarked by planners. But to move ahead, they'd need approval from Pictou Landing First Nation and the then Federal Department of Indian Affairs. Examples of systems similar to Boat Harbour were shown to community members. Public meetings were held. Today, members of the First Nations say planners and engineers lied to them by saying Boat Harbour would not be a toxic affair. But the plan is approved. Boat Harbour Pictou Landing First Nation is given $60,000, $500,000 today, to compensate for the loss of hunting and fishing revenue. Boat Harbour Effluent Treatment Facility starts receiving wastewater. It's built to receive millions of liters of mill effluent every day, piped from the mill to settling ponds before being discharged into the Northumberland Strait. Effluent treatment improves over the years. The mill begins operating in 1967. By the early 70s, CBC News reports residents and fishermen are speaking out about the mill's pollution, that it's affecting their health, livelihoods, and the area's marine life. Pictou Landing First Nation begins action against the federal government for not protecting their interests. 7 years later, $35 million is paid in an out-of-court agreement. The mill is acquired by Kimberly-Clark in 1995. The mill also took over operation of the treatment site. The province promises to have Boat Harbour closed by December 2005. It also signed an indemnity agreement that year, meaning it would assume the costs of environmental liability of Boat Harbour. Effluent leaks from the mill into the East River in 1997. The mill closes. Pictou Landing First Nation signs a memorandum of understanding with Kimberly-Clark for financial compensation in exchange for continued use of Boat Harbour. The province extends the lease of Boat Harbour until 2030. Nina Paper acquires the mill in 2004. Just 4 years later, the mill is sold to equity firms and becomes known as Northern Pulp. In late 2008, CBC News reports of an effluent leak. 190 people are temporarily laid off from the mill, but they would eventually return to work. In March, CBC News reports the provincial government is loaning the mill $15 million to remain open and safeguard jobs. The next year, Northern Pulp announces it would spend $5 million to build a system to cut down on the smell from the mill. The province loans Northern Pulp $75 million so they could buy land to guarantee a supply of wood. Paper Excellence buys Northern Pulp. In 2014, a pipe leaks effluent. The mill shuts down. A blockade was set up by community members, and it comes to an end only when the province agrees to look at closing Boat Harbour for good. The Nova Scotia government issues a legally binding order telling Northern Pulp to cut emissions that were above acceptable standards. They were told to meet those standards by May of 2015 or face shutdown. In January, the McNeil government imposes new regulations on the mill. The mill takes the province to court later in the year, saying many of the conditions are impossible to meet. However, the Boat Harbour Act is introduced in the spring and later passed. Northern Pulp's lease of Boat Harbour until 2030 is shortened. The legislation says the treatment site will close in 2020. The mill halts temporarily to install new air pollution equipment. The mill passes inspection and resumes operations. In 2017, Northern Pulp submits its proposal to replace its current effluent treatment practices. Wastewater would pass through an activated sludge treatment system and settle in a large tank on mill property. Then it would be sent through a subsea pipe into the Northumberland Strait. A land and sea protest sends a clear message to the company and politicians. The proposal will not be tolerated. It's later revealed that $6 million of taxpayers' money was paid to Northern Pulp. Opponents call it a conflict of interest. The Premier says there's a liability for the taxpayer when it comes to the mill. Northern Pulp says it's unlikely it could meet all of the government's proposed deadlines, but that the pipeline discharge would meet federal water quality standards. In March of 2019, the government tells Northern Pulp their proposal isn't good enough. Then Environment Minister Margaret Miller asks for a focus report with more information. The federal government commits $100 million to help clean up Boat Harbour. Northern Pulp's focus report is filed in October. The company says Boat Harbour would need to stay open for 21 months to allow construction of a new treatment site. On December 16th, the federal Environment Minister announces he won't designate the project for a federal impact assessment. The next day, the province says it needs more information before it can approve the proposal. But 5 days before Christmas, Premier Stephen McNeil announces he won't amend the Boat Harbour Act, honoring his promise to the Pictou Landing First Nation. Boat Harbour would cease operations on January 31st, 2020. McNeil also announces a $50 million transition fund. He pledges industry workers will not be left out in the cold. The estimated cost of cleaning up Boat Harbour is more than $200 million.